Hello everybody and welcome to the Greater Glider Permanent Protection Workshop. My name's Amelia Young. I'm the National Campaigns Director with the Wilderness Society. Thank you so much for being part of the Biolinks Squirrel and Greater Glider Symposium, which is on this week, and we've already had many fabulous keynotes earlier this month as well. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are respectively gathered today, but particularly I'd like to say that the Biolinks Alliance is proud to acknowledge the traditional owners of the places where we all live and work. We recognise and respect the enduring relationship traditional owners have with lands and waters, and we pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend special acknowledgement and welcome to any Indigenous Australians who are with us here today. We're all here today to share expert knowledge and practical experience to restore landscapes at scale, with a particular focus on the role of permanent protection for the greater glider. There'll be a survey to evaluate today's workshop, and the link will be posted in the chat throughout this session. Please feel free to click through and complete that survey. It'll also be circulated by email after the workshop. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions. We'd love to hear from all of you. And I've got to say, personally, I'm so excited to see so many familiar names in the attendee list here as well. I know that there's a lot of people with a deep interest and care for this species and a lot of practical experience. So after we've heard from our panel members, we've got Matt Ruchel, Executive Director with the Victorian National Parks Association, James Fitzsimmons from the Nature Conservancy, and Chris Schuringa from the Goongerah Environment Centre, GECO, out in East Gippsland. After we've all had a bit of a chat about the Greater Glider, we will hear from you. So please post your questions through into the chat function in Zoom and we'll share them. Also, if you'd like to have a bit of a conversation in the chat between yourselves, that's been something that's been really positive in some of the other workshops as well. First, I've got a tiny handful of slides though, just to give a quick introduction about two key things that have happened in both the policy space, but also the landscape space for this species in the last 12 months. So to set the scene, I will just share my screen. So for this Greater Glider Permanent Protection Workshop, it's quite important that we recognise just how unique this animal is. I mean, we all know that it's an incredibly unique species, but it's facing a range of issues, which means it's in quite extraordinary decline, up to 80% over the last 20 years in terms of the populations up and down the eastern seaboard. And we know that this is from a range of threats, whether it's climate change itself, climate-induced bushfires, changes in the protein structure of the leaves that it eats, whether it's a direct threat to habitat like native forest logging. For these reasons and many others, the species is listed at both state and federal levels, yet we still continue to see some pretty extraordinary declines. And that's why this question of what role of permanent protection is so important for this animal. Two things have happened of great significance for this species in the last 12 months. Number one, the Andrews Labor state government announced an end to native forest logging by 2030. And this happened in November last year when they announced a native forest transition package to the tune of $120 million, ostensibly to support Victoria's native forest logging industry to move away from native timber and into plantations. And this is significant for this species because the Threatened Species Scientific Committee itself has recognised that logging is a key threat to the animal and it is one that we can control. The government's announcement included a suite of immediate protection areas, otherwise known as IPAs. If you hear our panelists talking about IPAs, this is what they're referring to, immediate protection areas for the greater glider, but also for a range of other species. And at the time, the government also announced a refreshed greater glider action statement. And the action statement itself sets out these areas of immediate protection, 96,000 hectares across the state that will be immediately exempt from logging. At the time, the responsible minister said this is the largest environmental protection plan in our state's history. Well, let's hear what our panelists have to say about that. The second thing that happened in the last 12 months for this animal, and many others, of course, were the bushfires of last summer. And this simple map gives you an insight into how the fires affected East Gippsland, one of the strongholds for this species in the state. Grey is the burnt area, green is public land, and that lemony colour is private land. Here are some of the figures. The upshot is that we know a quarter of all available habitat for the greater glider was affected, if not destroyed, in last summer's bushfires. And so we need to look carefully at how the forest ecosystem itself is protected and restored in order for this species to persist. There is one area in East Gippsland up in the north, particularly an area called the Cottonwood Range, which is a stronghold for the greater glider, which is unburnt forest. And I'd like to thank the Victorian National Parks Association and also the Fauna and Flora Research Collective for the data and for this map as well. A minute ago, I mentioned IPAs, immediate protection areas. Let's have a look at where those are compared to unburnt greater glider habitat. So we have some IPAs in the far east, which have been heavily affected by bushfire. We have some in the northeast up around the Strathbogies. We also have some in the Central Highlands. But there's a key question about what is happening with regards to land management and also permanent protection in that area up in the northeast that remains unburnt after last summer's bushfires. So there are two things that happened for this animal in the last 12 months. A very big and significant policy announcement from the state government and large, unsurprising but catastrophic bushfires that have greatly impacted this species. Thanks to Gail Osborne for this gorgeous photo of a greater glider in the Wombat forest out to the west, which we'll also be talking about. Now, let's get into it and hear from our panellists. To start with, I wonder if I could invite Matt and James, please, to tell us a little bit about what the lie of the land is here in Victoria. What types of land-based protection mechanisms are used to protect greater glider habitat? Matt, could I ask you to kick us off?
Sure, thanks very much. Nice to see everybody here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. So I suppose in very high level terms, there's at least half a dozen different sorts of approaches and categories for protection of land. Of course, you've got the formal reserve system, your national parks, things protected under the National Parks Act, things under the Crown Land Reserves Act. There's a dozen or more categories of different types of parks, which importantly protect areas permanently. So that's either national parks, state parks, things under the National Parks Act or things under the Crown Land Reserves Act. You've got private land covenants, such as Trust for Nature and variations on that from the department, which work on private land. You've got, of course, the informal reserve system, which is talked about a lot in terms of regional forest agreements, which is essentially the zoning system. So things like special protection zones. And then I suppose you've got prescriptions, logging rules, that sort of thing about particular species and detections and that sort of stuff, which is embedded in the Code of Timber Production. And then I suppose you've got an emergent thing like the IPAs, I suppose, are a halfway house where you've got threatened species laws. So theoretically under the EPBC Act, the Federal Environmental Laws, and under the amended Fauna and Fauna Guarantee Act in Victoria, you have the potential for critical habitat determinations and a range of other tools, though none of those have really been used yet. And there's really no guidelines yet about how those things will be done and applied. I suppose the IPAs, in a way, are a tool that's been developed for this, but it's important to frame that while they're an important political commitment, they've currently got no real legal status. So they need to be something else if they're going to survive changes of government or have some legal effect.
Thanks, Matt. So it's a bit complicated. There's a range of options, tools and levers. James, what's your experience been in relation to some of the things that are available for this species?
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. It's important to note this this reserve system we have in Victoria has been built up over almost a century now at the National Parks Estate, but certainly over the last 50 years in the forested estate, there's been, I guess, a more strategic way of looking through with the Land Conservation Council originally looking at how state forests should be used, where national parks should be, etc. And then probably in more recent times through, as Matt mentioned, the regional forest agreement process, which was meant to really resolve how do we get a balance between the timber harvesting industry as well as conservation areas. And we saw sort of large scale new informal reserves, we call them, into the system, special protection zones that came into place around that time. And these followed some quite important, I guess, scientific guidelines. So what we call the Janus criteria. So this concept that we wanted to get some 15% of pre-European extents of each of the ecosystems within the reserve system. But then for other certain criteria, such as old growth forest or rare and endangered ecosystems, we actually wanted to get a whole lot more in the reserve system as well. And for things like old growth, for instance, they were some good surrogates for things like greater glider. There's a lot of debate around how effective the regional forest agreements have been, but they certainly did bring new land into the reserve system at the time. And then more recently, there's been, I guess, more government involved decisions around increased reservation in East Gippsland outside of those more formalised public consultation processes. As Matt noted, though, you know, we've got ongoing processes at the moment. The Central West investigation from the Victorian Environment Assessment Council is currently ongoing. You know, final recommendations are out there for decision by government right now.
Thanks, James. Chris, could I bring you in and just ask you if you could, for all of us, paint a picture of what it's like out on the ground, out in East Gippsland for the greater glider at the moment, please?
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, I think things are pretty dire at the moment out in East Gippsland. I mean, obviously the bushfires, yeah, really heavily impacted the greater glider's habitat, and also then sort of the issues around historic logging and sort of the unburnt areas that haven't been disturbed are sort of shrinking and becoming more and more fragmented, and that's really pushing the greater glider populations, I suppose, in yeah, just further into decline. So I think on the ground, yeah, it's a pretty worrying, scary situation, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And Matt, East Gippsland's not the only stronghold for the greater glider here in Victoria. Can you tell us a little bit more about the populations in the west of the state and why permanent protection is so important over there? You're on mute.
Sorry, seniors moment. Thanks, Mills. So I think obviously East Gippsland's very strong, and you've got your populations of Central Highlands. Strathbogies, of course, a very significant population, and smaller populations of places like Merburn North, which was also included in the IPAs. But Wombat Forest particularly is a really important place. It's the most western population of the greater gliders. We, thanks to Wombat Forest Care's sort of really good on-ground survey, citizen science work, we pulled together a bit of analysis early last year, which found, based on that surveys, you've got a pretty significant population of Wombat Forest as well. Similar in terms of gliders per hectare to the Strathbogies, and exceeding some of those thresholds in East Gippsland that trigger restrictions and so on. So it's an important place. And I suppose one observation I'd make is, as we've seen with the bushfires, we've got extensive habitat impacts in East Gippsland, Central Highlands, we've had fires in the past. There is probably merit in spreading the protection of your populations. Wombat's fairly isolated from the forests in the east, as is Strathbogies to a point, whereas, as we've seen with the increasing frequency of these landscape scale fires, you know, they can, so having a series of populations that are secure has probably got some merit, though I don't have any data particularly on that. So we're keen for the Wombat, as James mentioned, for the recommendations to be accepted for the Wombat Forest, which is largely making that area into a national park and a series of regional parks.
So one of the things that the refreshed action statement did was supposedly bring into effect some protections in parts of the state where there were none previously for the greater glider. I'm wondering if one of you would like to just unpack what actually happened in this new action statement, because as part of it, there's also a view that protections that did exist in East Gippsland were weakened as part of that exercise. So Chris, Matt or James, would one of you like to share just a quick summary of what the action statement has in it before we then move to looking at other types of obligations?
Yeah, I could speak to that. And I think this has been spoken about as well before about the existing prescriptions in East Gippsland, or the current prescriptions in East Gippsland, which is if you find more than 10 greater gliders within a spotlight kilometre, then a special protection zone is then put around those detections. I think it's up to 100 hectares, pretty sure. And the action statement, which isn't legally enforceable yet, is it's a 40% basal area retention wherever 5 or more are found in a spotlight kilometre. And so it sort of loses the special protection zone, smaller detection, triggering for the prescription. But yeah.
Thanks, Chris. And so, James, that's a little bit about what the action statement says. Can you take us through what other state and federal obligations there are for protecting this species?
Thanks, Amelia. Well, I guess, as you mentioned, they're listed under both the State Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act here in Victoria, and also under the Federal Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And so that means that both the state and the federal governments have responsibilities to protect, conserve, manage this species into the future. So the action statement, which is kind of the live document here in Victoria, sets out a range of objectives around protection, etc., forest management and the like. But the federal recovery plan hasn't quite been released or developed yet. And so that's sort of something that needs to be happening at a federal level to see that statement out there, to give clear guidance, not just in Victoria, but obviously New South Wales and Queensland, where the species also occurs. So that's still to come into play. But yeah, the obligations are there, not just under state and federal legislation, but, our global commitments under the Convention on Biological Diversity is to conserve and maintain viable populations of species such as this.
Thanks, James. What about critical habitat listings? I get asked about this a lot. Would you say the EPBC or the FFG listing of critical habitat, and there's some detail in each of those respective acts, is a useful tool generally, but also for emergency situations such as following the bushfires?
Look, at the moment, under both federal and state legislation, they've been fairly underutilised, it's fair to say, that mechanism. So critical habitat, the idea being is that where a particular area or habitat type is identified as really important for that species survival, extra protection can be afforded, often temporary protection as sort of short-term responses. But we have seen very little application of that either in Victoria or the federal level. And I think the recent bushfires highlighted how useful that thing could be if applied and applied well. At a federal level, we still have some, fairly big limitations around, yes, you can apply critical habitat in theory anywhere, but it's only enforceable on Commonwealth land, of which there's almost none in the forested landscape. So really, in terms of its usefulness, that really needs to be altered, and hopefully under the review of the EPBC Act that's happening now, hopefully they make that tweak to make it applicable to any lands. But I think there's got to be a political will also to use this mechanism where it's needed at the right time. And I think the big fire events, we probably need to think more laterally around how do we apply critical habitat to just give these refuges the buffer and time frame they need to help that population expand out.
So I can probably add a little bit on the Vic component. Is my mic working all right? Yes. So the renewed amended Fauna and Fauna Guarantee Act in Victoria, which came into force in June, has some new provisions for critical habitat determinations. It hasn't been used yet. There was also the similar mechanism in the older Act, but it was never really used, or it was used once and failed, and then not used again. And I suppose the question is, there's still yet to be guidelines and so on developed for how will work in Victoria, what it actually does. It is, as James says, only for 10 years. So there is potential, but it's certainly not a well-developed method at this stage.
So there's a few different options, and one of the reasons I think there's been an interest increasingly so around the role of permanent protection is because of some of the problems with the Code of Forest Practice and the level of enforcement. Chris, I wonder if I could invite you just to share with the room what your experience has been, and I know that this is shared by many citizen scientists, including a lot of folks who are with us here today, the problems with the Code of Forest Practice and the lack of enforcement, and what the experience is there as it relates to the glider.
Yeah, so certainly it's a tough one because it is sort of like there's so many different experiences, I suppose, in terms of, yeah, frustration around reporting threatened species, and then the actions that are then taken, or what happens then in terms of the department and communicating with the Environment Department as well. So it basically works that citizen scientists put a lot of work and a lot of effort into writing these reports, and then when the forest does end up being logged or not verified by the department on the ground, in terms of gliders, yeah, it's a really frustrating process, and especially in terms of the Central Highlands, I suppose the 40% basal area prescription in the action statement. I mean, it doesn't create informal reserves. It doesn't create any reserves at all, really. It's incredibly difficult to actually monitor on the ground, like determining basal area, and actually the practicality of checking in to make sure that they're actually putting in these prescriptions is difficult on its own. And so, yeah, I think as well, given that you don't actually have to put in place protections around the sightings of greater gliders. So you might find a small population across an area, and the only places that will be reserved as part of that 40% might be along creeks or along the edge. It doesn't necessarily include where gliders are actually found. So that's also really frustrating. So you go into an area and find a glider, and you might come back after it's been logged and the tree where it was living is gone. So yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. So James, back to you. Thinking about the state and national and international obligations you outlined earlier, and also thinking about some of the practical experience on the ground when it comes to gliders, what role do you think permanent protection ought to play in ensuring conservation security for the species, particularly post bushfires?
Sure. Thanks, Amelia. I mean, look, protected areas are still kind of a cornerstone of conservation in so many ways. And indeed, these are embedded in our state and our national policies, and indeed our international obligations under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And indeed, next year, there'll be, I guess, a renewal of decadal targets around this, and there's a fair push for 30% protection by 2030 is kind of the new targets, where we're at 17% at the moment is the targets around the country. So this is, permanent protection is a fundamental part of what state governments do, federal governments do around species conservation. Having said that, I guess the bushfires have also shown us that, these areas aren't immune to big devastating effects either. And so we do need to think about both land tenure security for conservation, but also critical management and emergency response at the same time. And maybe, we do need to think about how do we broaden out our approaches, thinking about where critical populations are, and perhaps be putting more effort into some firefighting efforts around some of those in future. I think what the fires have shown us is that we probably need to have perhaps more of a focus when we think about assets in the landscape that we're fighting fires against. That we're also thinking about critical populations of habitat as well. That's not to say they're going to be, defendable all the time, but just having some more strategies around that for big fire events is also going to be important as well going forward. So, protected areas, national parks are not going to necessarily protect these species in big fire events like we've seen, but they are a critical part of the landscape for recovery and for preventing a whole range of threats that the gliders face at other times.
as you say, there's lots of different options, and in the recently renewed regional forest agreements, there is an opportunity for state and federal governments to conduct what's called a major event review, a review of operations under the regional forest agreements as a result of a catastrophic event like the bushfires. Chris, can I just ask you where you think the major event review is up to?
Yeah, I'm not really sure about the major event review and what sort of stage it's at the moment. From what I understand, there's been an agreement for the major event review to go ahead, but that there's no actual obligation under the recommendations from the review to actually act on them, so that they are recommendations. There's not actually concrete actions that come out of the major event review, which is, yeah, considering just how bad the bushfires were and sort of the emergency situation of it, that you know, there's logging being scheduled now in unburnt glider habitat, that logging is still going ahead in East Gippsland. The delays that come from these reviews that aren't enforceable, there's not concrete actions coming out of them. That's, yeah. I think it would be much more meaningful if there was protections put in place now, interim protections at least, to protect those populations of gliders that survived the bushfires.
Thanks, Chris. And Matt, thinking about all of this, how critical would you say permanent protection of sites with greater gliders is for the species survival? Earlier in the presentation, you spoke about the importance of making sure that we have distribution of populations across the state, and that we're really safeguarding the population diversity, but also distributing, I guess, the risk. Is permanent protection an important pillar of making sure we're doing that well?
Yeah, I think that's right. Permanent protection is a core cornerstone, the foundation of our efforts to conserve the species, and then it's complemented with other measures, whether that's the informal reserve or the other types of mechanisms that you can use for short-term protection. I think one of the pressing things at the moment is that the process around the IPAs, of course, governments have been distracted by bushfires and COVID, but the IPAs are exactly as they're called. They're immediate protected areas, but they're still not got any real clear picture of what they will turn into in the future. So I think there's a sort of a three-track obvious thing that can happen now. We've got moving fairly quickly for permanent protection in places like Strathbogie and the Merbau North, which are IPAs. You've got the extensive VAC investigations that have been done for the West, and including Wombat and moving forward on those recommendations to permanently protect those areas. And then I think East Gippsland and the Central Highlands to an extent are slightly different. There wasn't a lot of consultation around the design of the IPAs. The fires have obviously impacted on 90% of the IPA in East Gippsland. And I know in the Central Highlands, there was some significant areas that were missed in terms of incorporating that. So maybe there needs to be a transparent process about not so much reassessing, but re-emphasising and retweaking in a clear process to improve whatever those IPAs are going to turn into it on a permanent basis.
Thanks, Matt. And let's go to questions from the floor now. And to the heart of the issue you're talking about here, Bert sent something through earlier. It seems pretty logical to revisit East Gippsland's IPAs, especially in relation to results from recent research. But Matt, is there a political appetite, and how does the community achieve this?
Well, it's hard to tell if there's political appetite for anything much at the moment with the COVID, to be realistic. And so there's a big distraction there. The bushfires also have slowed a lot of what seems to be normal departmental work down. So we're in a bit of a holding pattern and have been. I suppose the trick now is making sure that these issues are front and centre on the agenda when we start to look at, you know, recovery from COVID and those things, and that the agenda isn't just about straight economic development, but there's also societal improvements. So these things are not just good for the environment, they're also societal benefits. Things like national parks are also good for people as well as for the animals. So we need to make sure that that plank of recovery is front and centre when the governments return to focusing on these issues.
Thanks, Matt. James, would you care to give a comment on political appetite for action on Greater Glider in the context of COVID or otherwise?
Not so much on political appetite. I think what the fires, though, have highlighted is, I guess, the big challenge that we face with such large areas burnt. That just creates a big challenge for land uses, those various things that we want in our forest landscape, be they timber production, wildlife conservation, recreation. Once you get very large areas burnt like this, all of a sudden the unburnt areas become all the more competitive. And it's a big challenge that we're going to have to think about generally as these fires are predicted to get worse, is how we're going to deal with this, how we're going to think in perhaps a more flexible way around land use zonings, etc. And I think these fires have highlighted, and I guess the plight of things like greater gliders highlight the big challenge we're going to face with balancing that wildlife conservation with other uses of the forest as we go along, and our thinking around critical habitat, reserves, etc. at the same time. So yeah, to me, it creates a big challenge that we need to collectively think about from a land use allocation decision point of view.
And even more so, I guess, in the context of a policy commitment such as the kind that we have at the minute to transition the industry away from native forests and into plantations by 2030. And what does a large event like the bushfire mean for that timeline, given what the science is showing, and also given, as Bert's indicating, what the community thinks about how these resources should be used. Chris, what are your views around political appetite in the context of COVID post-bushfires for action on the Greater Glider?
Yeah, it's a big question. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's certainly something that needs to be addressed, and I think that certainly COVID has presented, a really challenging situation because the government is really focused on this, on a pandemic, on this crisis. And I mean, the bushfires weren't that long ago, and it's sort of just gone from one crisis to another. And so dealing with the impact of the bushfires has probably, fallen under the radar. And it's been hard as well for citizen scientists not being able to be out in the forest as well and not be able to do that critical surveying work, be on the ground and understand what's going on. That's also been incredibly difficult, especially because it's a lot of community groups and those citizen scientists that are doing the work to help protect these species and sort of see what's going on the ground. So it's tough. But I think especially given the impacts, like just going back to the protection thing, but talking about the impacts of the bushfires on the reserves, I mean, the government has an obligation. The reserve system in East Gippsland has been extremely compromised. I think it's over 2/3 of the reserve, formal reserve across East Gippsland, which has burnt as well. So considering not just the IPAs, but the impacts across the whole reserve system, now these critical unburnt areas, they are really important and will form the basis for expansion of reserves. And so I think that's really important to consider and think about.
Thanks, Chris. We have another question from Bert around gliders in the Northeast and a comment on the level of data for those populations. And a question, how can a lack of permanent protection in Northeastern Victoria be addressed? Matt, can I go to you first?
Well, there's various formal mechanisms for doing in Northeast. So I think the question specifically about, obviously there's not always consistent data and survey effort in those areas. Often with these things, it's a mix of government survey effort and citizen science. So understanding the distributions in those places is important. You could also do formal investigations. BAC has been a long-standing mechanism for looking at the appropriate tenures for public land, but that could be complemented by some strategic work on what the glider populations are in the Northeast. I haven't seen that work, others might have. So I think the Northeastern is a good question about, what's going on out there and how does that fit with the rest of the population.
James, go ahead on the Northeast.
I guess, Amelia, perhaps to the broader point Matt was raising, I think, with the state government's announcement of a phase out of the timber industry, I guess, across the forested estate, it does raise the question about how is land use allocation going to be resolved from here on. And again, I think the Victorian Environmental Assessment Council, as a long-standing entity with a lot of experience in this space, would be kind of the logical entity to go through and look at, I guess, patches of forest in a systematic way to determine best use. So again, just sort of a push for, Victoria has been, I guess, certainly in Australia leader in this space in terms of land use designation on public land. And we shouldn't forget that we have an entity there that's specifically set up to help resolve this, working with community consultation, working with the best science and other use interests to resolve public land use allocation issues. And I would have thought that hopefully that the VAC have a strong role in thinking about the future of the forests.
Thanks, James. And are you able to help us out with Paul McGregor's question? Is planning for future areas taking account of biolinking zones between east, central, west and northeast Victorian greater glider habitats?
It's a good question. I don't know the current thinking there, but again, I guess with the rethinking of the forest estate more generally with the phase out of the timber industry, one would certainly hope so. One would think that would be, not just for gliders, but for a whole range of species, and thinking about climate change and modelling of species distributions. I saw a reference to refugia in there. I think this is a big opportunity to kind of rethink the whole estate as to where best placing national parks should be. Obviously, some need to get larger, but also thinking about different uses in different areas to accommodate recreational and nature conservation at the same time, but with a an eye to climate change, which we perhaps haven't had in the past in land use allocation in Victoria.
So
Great, thanks. Go ahead, Matt.
If I can add something on the biolinks, I suppose it's interesting. If we go back a few years, the Land and Water Biodiversity White Paper, which was, I don't know, a decade ago or something, 8 years, which was a sort of a precursor, I suppose, to our current biodiversity strategy, had a great deal of emphasis on the establishment of, multi-tenure biolinks, public land plus private land plus planning controls plus all those other things, and they're complicated vehicles. But that emphasis has probably dropped out of state government policy settings in the current biodiversity strategy. So I'll make that observation. So there's probably a bit of a renewed need for highlighting the value of these sorts of biolinks, but also they are often better driven from the bottom up, and so the opportunities always there, as many probably at this forum know, that the biolinks being driven by the community are sometimes more successful than top-down ones.
So Matt, Tandy is asking here about climate refugia and stable habitat cores forming the backbone of our conservation network. Has that fallen out of Victorian biodiversity strategies as well, in the same way as biolinks might have been, even though more than ever before, we do need it to actually be front and centre of it all?
Yeah, I'm a bit confused about the climate refugia stuff in terms of policy settings. So there's certainly acknowledgement of climate refugia and the need for it in the context of the regional forest agreements, which people may know have been renewed just recently for another decade. But when you look at the detail of what is it exactly, it's very unclear about how you identify it. I've talked to a few people in the scientific community, and there's a divergence of view about how you'd actually do the work to pick the places where the best benefit is. I'm sure the science is there, but it doesn't appear to me to be in a coherent package that you can start to do assessments of particular areas to highlight their value for climate refugia. So I would say the policy setting's not quite there yet to drive that, and I'm not even sure the science or the method, if you like, for assessing it is well established. But James, you might have a view on that too.
I think it's improving, Matt, and I think the science on this is constantly improving through the country. So, hopefully we do have more of that informing decision making going forward. Yeah.
Bert's also asking about how would an interested community or public lobby achieve VAC involvement, say, in forest management he's particularly interested in the Northeast, but other places. What's the roadmap? A minute ago, Matt, you said Biolinks are generally successful from a policy perspective when they are obviously scientifically sound, but also robustly advocated for by the community. What would your insights be when it comes to forest management?
Well, VMPA's always had a strong support for VAC processes. Victoria, I suppose, has been a leader in that space of having a specific institution that look to go through a planning process for public land only. So VAC is restricted in its scope in terms of recommendations that it can make about other land. It can do strategic work, which sort of for information purposes, and their 2010 native veg inquiry, for example, is an example of that, but the recommendations aren't binding. So that sort of strategic work at a larger landscape region is not common, either bioregionally or in designated regions. And so we need to do more of it. People may reflect in Victoria, as a young student or ecologist, the best maps you could find and the only real information at a landscape scale that you would find is your LCC report. And by the way, can people stop sending them to our office? Thanks. Which had, that consolidation of information across the landscape for both public and private land, and gives you a real insight into what the potential best use is. So more of that. So VAC is one vehicle, but there's also space for sort of other bioregional planning processes, I think, to help in that context.
Thanks, Matt. Chris, GECO, your organisation's been advocating for improved forest management in Far East Gippsland since the 90s. Would you like to add anything to this question about the role of the community in achieving better outcomes for forests and forest-dependent wildlife?
Yeah, and I think it's been mentioned in some of the other talks as well, like about community-run court cases as well as citizen science, and that most of the outcomes that we see in the forest, national parks, and things like that, it's a result of community action and community members really showing an interest in caring about what happens in the forest, and so yeah, I think it's so important. But it's hard then for areas where there's not a community base, and that doesn't mean that those areas should be overlooked or yeah.
Thanks, Chris. James, we've got a question here from Krista. Is there a role for increased permanent protection on private land to benefit the greater glider?
Sure. The answer is yes, absolutely. And particularly, I guess, where places up in the Strathbogies, for instance, where there is still a bit of private land with good quality native vegetation up there, where there's obviously overlap between greater glider habitat and private land with vegetation on, absolutely. So be they conservation covenants with the Trust for Nature, or even more informal things like Land for Wildlife. There's lots of programs out there that can certainly help in that regard. It's fair to say probably one of the limiting factors is resources for setting aside. So in New South Wales, for instance, their equivalent, the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, offers in perpetuity stewardship payments for landowners to undertake permanent conservation on their properties. And that's certainly something we should be looking at in Victoria to really, I guess, supercharge private land conservation and permanent protection, and really making it economically viable for landowners to do that. So there's definitely room, but there's room for improvement too.
Thanks, James. Matt, we've probably got 30 seconds for a view from you on private land, if you wish, before we bring things to a close. You're on mute if you're talking.
So agreeing with James, there is a role for private land. sometimes there's a view that there's not as much glider habitat on private land because a lot of it's in the sort of bigger public forest, but there's probably more than we think. So that's worth having a look at. And I agree with James, there's a lack of resourcing on the private land space in Victoria. You know, there's ideas like having a revolving fund for things like the Trust for Nature, which requires some government investment, which would be an important initiative, which would sort of really supercharge the Trust's capacity to purchase land, you know, covenant it on, sell it, particularly where we're getting into peri-urban areas or higher value areas where the land prices are very high, or larger properties for that matter, which happens up in the Northeastern and in around the Alps, where they're big properties, and you know, you might be able to do some planning to protect some, sell the rest on.
And linear remnants, particularly roadside remnants, how important might these be for the glider? Matt, James or Chris, a view on that?
Don't know about greater gliders. I know certainly for other gliders, so others might have a better sense of that. But roadsides in general are very important. Some parts of the state, they are the predominant piece of vegetation left, along with some of the ground water frontages. So critically important as linkages and buffers. I'm not sure how. I just don't know how important they are for the greater glider.
No, same here, except to reiterate that in some places, squirrel gliders, you know, roadsides are critical for their survival in the landscape. So it will be worth more investigation, say up in the Strathbogies, as suggested, just to determine, you know, the extent of usage. And if they are using that predominantly, certainly thinking about, you know, roadside management plans to make sure that those trees are protected.
Thanks so much, James and Matt. So to finish, just a view from each of you on what's the most important step that needs to be taken to protect the habitat of the greater glider as there is a transition away from native forest logging in this state. Chris, first to you, if I could, please.
I think certainly stronger protections for the gliders where they're actually found from the impacts of logging. Certainly, I think that's still a real issue and a problem. And considering the impacts of the bushfires, I think it's probably the most important thing to actually protect them where they're found across the state.
Chris. Yeah. Matt, your views. What's the most important thing?
Well, I'm agreeing, protecting that unburned habitat, but also moving the processes that have started into more permanent settings. So I think in my mind, it's, you know, let's do the Strathbogies and Merboon North. Let's agree to the Wombat being protected as recommended by VAC. Let's properly assess the Central Highlands and East Gippsland and protect those areas that haven't been burnt, particularly in East Gippsland in the short term.
And James, lastly from you, what's important in the next decade for the glider?
I guess as we're, as a policy commitment for transitioning out of native forest timber harvesting, is that the VAC does have a strong role, and it also has a close eye to our national obligations around metrics, around how much reserves we need in the system, but also a close eye on our species requirements as well, with another eye to thinking about those issues of big events like bushfires and how we buffer ourselves in the future for those critical habitats.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Chris, Matt and James, for sharing your views and insights today. Thanks everyone for coming along and participating. Some great questions there. And again, please go and fill in the survey to continue the conversation. Thanks to everybody for your involvement.